Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our Migrations Initiative Spring 2022 series. I'm Eleanor Painter, postdoctoral associate in migrations with the Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here for today's arts-focused event, Migration on Stage, Educating and Engaging Through the Arts. We begin, as we do all these events, by acknowledging that we speak about migration issues from sites shaped by acts and histories of dispossession and displacement. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayukono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayukono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayukono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayukono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. Reflecting the breadth and depth of the university-wide migrations initiative, this speaker series has included talks representing a range of disciplinary and methodological approaches to the study of migration. We focused in particular on the relationship between migration, racism, and dispossession. And with today's webinar, we shift a bit to think more directly about the representation of these issues for broader publics. What is the role of art in communicating the realities of migration? What is the place of imagination and performance in engaging issues related to border crossing? It's such a pleasure to have with us today representatives from the Ithaca-based Cherry Arts organization. And the 3 presenters you'll hear are all involved in work related to this group's season of migration-related plays put on stage in Ithaca, with one upcoming that will also be live streamed. And we'll hear more about that in just a bit. I'll let them tell you more about their work with Cherry Arts and also work related to other arts initiatives more broadly. I'll introduce each of them now, and after they present, we'll have time for discussion. So please feel free and encouraged to find the chat box on your screen where you're live streaming and drop in questions that we can take up during the discussion. Andre Nascimento is a PhD student of Spanish in the Department of Romance Studies at Cornell. His primary field is radical democracy, and his research interests include political philosophy and protest literature. Before graduate school, he served as an interpreter for state and private agencies, including the Brazilian Ministry of Oil and Gas, UN Women, and UNISUR. Andy Culpitz is a theater artist and scholar from the hills of northern New England, whose scholarly interests include rural theatricality, popular performance, and political action. He holds a BA from Brown University in theater and performance studies, as well as comparative literature, and is currently pursuing a doctorate in performing and media arts at Cornell. And Aisha Stratford, who will start us off today, is a dramaturg, playwright, and lecturer at Cornell University's Department of Performing and Media Arts, as well as Director of Education at the Cherry Arts, which I've just mentioned, which is a not-for-profit arts facilitator and presenting organization. Her plays have won several awards and been produced around the world, including at National Theatre London, Solo Chicago, and the New York City Fringe. Locally, she's co-authored 2 walking headphone plays for the Cherry and adapted A Christmas Carol for the Hangar Theatre. Her work on the Cherry's season seeks to provide meaningful production context for audiences and to spark, foster, and facilitate community conversations, as well as inspire action about displacement, dispossession, migration, and oppression. She holds a PhD in theater history and dramatic literature from Cornell and an MFA in creative writing from the University of San Francisco. Thanks again to all of you for being here today, and thanks, as always, to our eCornell colleagues who are producing this from behind the scenes. Aisha, I'll hand it over to you to begin.
Awesome. Thank you, Eleanor, and thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. I'm really excited to talk about the work that we've been doing at the Cherry and sort of think about how some of that work is being used to serve these sort of larger conversations in Cornell and in the community about migration and displacement. So a couple of quick things, I guess, about the Cherry first. So the Cherry is a not-for-profit organisation. It's been around for about 5 years, and it started primarily as a company that would do 2 things, one of them being to host and facilitate other artists and small companies in the area by making our space available and supporting the work of area artists with production resources. And then secondly, to find ways to stage the work of a group of Ithaca area artists who sort of formed a collective. And this collective, called the Cherry Collective, is a group of artists who are at Cornell, at Ithaca College, sort of all over the place, and just in Ithaca more generally. So that was sort of the goal of the organisation. And we have we had one space originally. We have a theatre space, which is where most of the work gets produced, the performance work gets produced. And then we also now have two other spaces. We have a gallery space and a studio space. So those spaces are being used to do all kinds of work, puppetry, dance, cabaret, music, multidisciplinary work, installations, all kinds of things. And we're just loading in our first gallery show at the moment. It's super exciting. So that's what we do at the Cherry. There's a slide here, I think, of the theatre space itself that shows you a little bit of what it looks like. It's a very flexible space designed to be used in a whole bunch of different ways. So rather than just having an audience sort of in a proscenium theatre sort of looking at action being performed for them, the goal of this space is to be flexible so that the audience can be in the space or around the space. We've had shows where that have been sort of staged in the round with people coming and going through and amongst the audience. So the idea of a really flexible staging, I think, is part of the Cherry's mission to be sort of community focused in the work that we do. So that's the Cherry. And the next thing I wanted to kind of just sort of touch on briefly as a sort of orientation for the discussion today is to talk a little bit about the goals of our season. So we're the happy recipients of a Migrations Initiative grant from Cornell and Carnegie Mellon. And the goals for this grant were initially to produce a season of performance work, and a full season is 4 shows for us. And the idea was that we would select a season of 4 shows that all chose very different ways of approaching this topic, and that we would look to find the intersections between the different shows as a way of starting conversations. So one aspect of this season is that we also wanted to provide faculty-led talkbacks for every show that we do. And those talkbacks are really designed to kind of give audiences a chance to talk about the work, share their experience of seeing it, but also hear from different Cornell faculty who have expertise in different areas. So we've been doing that, and we'll continue to do it. And then another thing that we've been doing is providing contextual and educational materials. And you'll hear a lot about that today as we sort of talk about the show that's about to open on Friday. We're opening a show on Friday. So we'll talk a little bit about those as we move forward today. Another goal of the grant initiative for us has been to engage graduate and undergraduate students in research. And for us, because we're a company of theatre artists, this often means practice-based research, which means researching topics through creative interventions, through sort of artistic exploration, as well as through a sort of more traditionally scholarly lens. So that's the kind of research that we have students engaging in. We wanted to include marginalised voices in both the process and the performance. So it's been really important to think about casting, for example, and how we would reflect diversity in the casting of the shows that we're doing as part of this season. And then the natural extension of that is that we also wanted to produce a season of work that was going to speak to a very diverse audience. And so the season is chosen in part to kind of try and think about the very many different intersections in our community and how we can create a season that would be of interest and serve all of those different constituents. So that's kind of just an overview of the sort of thinking behind the season, the construction of the season itself. So I'll move on to talking about the first of the shows in the season, which has already happened. So that show was called An Odyssey, and it was a community-led project. It was co-produced with the Hangar Theatre. It's the first time there's been a collaboration with between the Hangar and the Cherry. And just kind of like, I'm just moving through a slide here to make sure I can see what's happening. So the Odyssey had several elements of the way that show was approached that was sort of really trying to think about questions of community, not just in terms of the story that we were telling, but also in terms of how the story was being told. So a really important question for us as we were sort of thinking about how to use theatre to explore these larger questions about migration and displacement was to think about community as a lens that guided the way the work was made. So process, not just product. So that involved a couple of things. Firstly, it involved collaboration. And as I said, this was a collaboration with the Hangar Theatre. So it was two theatre companies with different audience bases and different resources working together. The second thing was that we invited a very diverse group of actors to come and work with us. So we had actors across a range of ages, for example. Our youngest actors, I think, are still in middle school. And then we had sort of seasoned professional actors who are faculty members. We had essentially first-time performers. So a real range of people in terms of their experience in the theatre arts, and trying to shoot for sort of as diverse a cast as possible to try and tell the story about a community. The process itself was very community driven as well. We started with sort of story circles where people in the casts were invited to talk about what they thought of when they thought about voyages and home and journeys and displacement and war and many of the themes that are in an Odyssey. And those sort of story circles helped to inform the work right down to how scenes were divided, right? So this adaptation was an adaptation that Sam Begellen, our director, was kind of shaping to fit the group of actors that were working on it. So things got sort of carved up amongst them and changed and emphasized depending on the input of the whole cast, which is a little unusual in a theatre production, but something that was really important to us in this community-focused area of the work. And then, of course, that's reflected in the actual play itself. So the story of Odysseus's long journey, which is, of course, a very old story, tends to be thought of as one of a hero's journey, a singular hero who triumphs across the seas for this remarkable 10-year journey home after the war in Troy. And for us, we wanted to really think about what does it mean to think about that story not as the story of a surviving hero, but as the story of an entire community, because he doesn't set out alone. He has many other ships with him. So we really wanted to try and make it a community story. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. I've got a couple of clips to share. And then the next thing that we did, of course, was we provided contextual materials that the audience had access to as part of their program that helped give them information about the production. And then there was a talkback that followed the production, the talkback with Athena Kirk from the Classics Department at Cornell and Bethany Dixon, who is a poet, and both of them are members of Ithaca City of Asylum. So that was a really fruitful conversation about the ways in which the themes in Homer kind of resonated today. So let's take a look at the first of these two clips from the production of An Odyssey. And the first of these two clips is really designed to show you how the role of the singular hero was sort of divided up and passed around amongst cast members to sort of emphasize the sort of community nature of this journey. So we'll take a look at that clip now.
But now you did.
Thanks for sharing that, Isha.
My pleasure. Okay, so there's a second clip that we can take a quick look at, which is a clip from the production a little later in the production that shows the loss of the boats at sea. And this, of course, is a big part of Homer's journey. And we've been thinking a lot about this recently with, at the time that we were doing this production, there were a lot of migrants and refugees trying to make their way across the Mediterranean. So this sort of question of dangerous sea voyages was much on our minds. And one of the things we wanted to emphasize that these sort of dangerous sea voyages are still happening all over the world. So this second clip sort of shows the theatrical approach to staging the kind of the loss of the ships at sea.
You think?
It's not our bag.
Maybe we should.
By the time the wind subsided, the fleet was scattered, smashed. 11 ships lost and all their scores of sailors. One boat left.
At last, the wind's blown out. You struck the wine-dark water with your oars. One ship left. One lonely ship left of 12.
You rode for days, not knowing where you were.
Okay, so that just gives you just like a little taste of how the production would have looked on. It was staged outside at the Hangar Theatre, and that's kind of gives you a bit of a sense of kind of what it looked like. So the next thing I wanted to share with you was just a slide of the production materials that were included with the program. So this was the result of some dramaturgical labor on the part of our undergraduate students and graduate students and myself, trying to pull together some sort of interesting contemporary references that sort of helped put this sort of Odyssey in some sort of context. So what you can see here are images from the Odyssey itself. The image on the left is of course of migrants getting into a boat trying to leave Cuba in one of the 4 sort of large waves of exodus from Cuba that have happened recently. And then there's lots of other sort of statistics on this trifold that kind of oriented people to thinking about how long people have survived at sea and how many people have made these sorts of journeys. So statistics and things like the fact that there were, at the time of we put this together, there were 26.4 million refugees in the world and a further 48 million internally displaced people, just to kind of like put Homer's story into a little bit of a contemporary context. So that's an Odyssey. That was the first show, like I said, and we started out our season with that show at the end of the summer. The second show in our season was a show called What Happens If I Don't, which is a really terrific play by a Serbian playwright, Eva Brdar, who's actually one of my favorites. She's pretty fabulous. And this play ran in December inside the Cherry Theatre space. And one of the things that we did to kind of like make this play, or think about the ways in which this play itself was thinking about borders in really interesting ways, is this play was a hybrid production. It was live streamed and in person at the same time, so that you could be in the theatre watching it, or you could be somewhere else altogether, anywhere watching it. And that if you were watching it, you were also watching the audience in the theatre watching it. This is sort of really interesting to sort of think about spatial relationships in terms of how the production worked. So in this particular production, the supplemental materials that we provided were in the form of a program note. And the program note was interesting because it incorporated student research. So we had students, we had a group of undergraduate research students who read the play and watched rehearsals of the play. And then we had sort of meetings to sort of talk about the play's themes and how they were working, and to talk about their own experience with thinking about displacement and identity and visibility, issues of visibility, particularly for women, and movement across borders and so forth. So that was the way that we dealt with that. Then once the production was coming down on the last day, we were lucky enough to have the playwright with us, and we were able to have a talkback with her. So we thought we'd share just a couple of minutes from the talkback with you now. And this section is a little section of the talkback where I'm talking with the director, Susanna Berryman, who's a faculty member from IC. So if we can play that.
One of the things that I really love about this play is how unanchored it is, how incredibly specific and how incredibly afloat at the same time. Right? We know she swims in an Asian sea. We know she shows up at a US border at some point, and we know she spends some of her childhood in a previously Soviet country with brutalist architecture. And that's what we know. Those are the three places we know, but we don't ever really know where she is or where these things happen. It could be in her memory, it could be now, it could be in America, it could not be. I sort of love that about it. So one of the things that really struck me was the way that this sort of question of sort of dispossession and feeling kind of like isolated or removed from yourself or your community or your family keeps resonating in all of these little vignettes. They all contain that. You know, even the ones that are rooted in place. So I was just curious about how that theme was resonating for you as you worked.
Well, I would also say that we, to a certain extent, many of us spend our lives trying to learn to live inside ourselves.
Yeah, 100%.
And there are a number of experiences, both for this character / these characters and us in our real lives, where ourselves are pulled away from our selves.
Yes, yes.
Our spirit is pulled away from ourselves, and we have to keep learning how to realign that and be at peace. And so there are a number of pieces of this where it seemed like that was
that sort of movement and sort of slippage away from something and then an attempt to try and get back to it. Or I mean that moment at the end where she's like, I can't see myself. Right, and it's that question of visibility and our visibility. Like there's moments where she's hyper visible to other people and doesn't want to be visible, but then she loses herself in some way, which I found very moving.
So these talkbacks that are a really important part of our approach to doing work in the Cherry are just a really wonderful opportunity to have conversations with the audience, but also with the actors, the director, the playwright, all kinds of people who are involved in the work. So it really is an opportunity to have conversations that sort of make the making of the work more transparent and sort of accessible to the audience, which is something that I personally really value in my own work, is the opportunity to do that. So that was and what happens if I don't. And the next play I want to talk about is the one that's about to open on Friday. So this is the third piece in the season. This is a play called The Wetsuit Man, which is a really interesting play. This is the first time it's been produced in English, in this English translation. It has been done in Europe. And the play the original script is by Freek Marianne, who's a Belgian playwright, and is translated by David McKay. It's the first time it's been done in English. We're really lucky to have it. We'll have the playwright with us in early April. So I'm looking forward to the chance to have a talk back with him after the production has taken place. But essentially, one thing that's really interesting about this particular play is of all the plays in the season, in some ways, this is the one that tackles questions of migration and the status of refugees and asylum seekers sort of in a somewhat direct way. It's a very interesting play. I hope you have a chance to see it. So one of the things that happens in this play is that we have a cast of 5 actors. So as we did with an Odyssey, and as we did with And What Happens If I Don't, the actors have an opportunity to play multiple roles. So we're really kind of exploring in the process of performing the work what it means for identity to be somewhat fickle and somewhat unstable. And particularly in The Wetsuit Man, what's really interesting is that that's actually wired into the script in a way that the actors are encouraged to kind of identify each other and decide who's going to be this character. So that's all actually part of the storytelling. And what that really does is that sort of really just emphasizes the ways in which visibility and invisibility and identity and access and the power to have your story told or tell the story is something that really sort of changes amongst community members depending on different factors. So again, kind of thinking really consciously about how process is part of this story here. So there's a statement from the playwright, which I just wanted to share with you, which gives you kind of a sense of where the play is coming from. And he writes, a few years ago, I read The Wetsuit Man, an article by the Norwegian journalist Anders Fjellberg about two refugees who tried to swim from Calais to England and were washed ashore in Norway and the Netherlands. I couldn't get the article out of my head where it got tangled up with other stories, frustrations, and observations about identity, all of which resulted in this play. And then he goes on to thank all of the people that were involved in his sort of way of thinking about the play, and how this composite for him is as real as anything non-fictional. So although its source is an actual event that was first documented as journalism, this sort of creative take on it for the playwright's perspective and from the perspective of us at the Cherries is kind of as real in some ways as some of the other ways of documenting it. So the main part of the work that we're doing at the moment is this thing called a virtual lobby display. And what that is very often in dramaturgy, you put together materials that kind of help put a show in some context for the audience, and those things will get displayed in a lobby. So probably a lot of you have seen that when you've gone to the theatre. You'll see all kinds of different materials sort of almost curated like a gallery display. Well, we don't have a lot of space at the Cherry, and we also didn't want to put all of the materials out there before the show. So Andre and Andy and I have been working on a virtual lobby display that will share materials and community resources with the audience, much the way a lobby display would. So I'm going to hand it over to Andre now to talk about the pieces of this puzzle that he's been working on.
Thank you. So following this wonderful work that the Cherry and Cornell have been doing, and also in terms of the commitment that this initiative has, I followed the Asia's lead and I decided to put some resources together. And the resources that I was thinking at first were the resources that people in our community in Ithaca or upstate New York, or in the Northeast at large, could try to utilize in order to extend help for refugees and asylum seekers and migrants in our region. So the first one that I had together was the Finger Lakes Rapid Response Network. That is a volunteer-based community in which people would just get together in case of an emergency, or let's say if a ICE agent goes to a family member, to a family house in trying to deport that family. Finger Lakes Rapid Response, they go to the place, they provide the family with the information they need, with their rights. So they also provide rides to the court, they provide translators, they tried also to have a type of intervention at place. And there is a phone number for a hotline so the people in the community could call them. The other resource that I found to be very interesting is that at Cornell, we have the Cornell Translator Interpreter Program that is also very interesting because they offer to the community translation and interpretation in case of emergency. So they would provide someone to go to court or to translate documents or to help with assistance so the migrants and refugees and asylum seekers in our region, they could find ways to navigate the system in another language. But also beyond having the linguistics assistant in another language, I found it would be interesting to put as another resource the Tompkins free English courses. So there is a whole bunch of interconnected network of English classes in all different levels available for free for our community, which also is very useful. And the other one was the Refugee, Resettlement, and Catholic Charities that we have in the region. So the Refugee Resettlement basically would help the refugees that we would receive in the region to get a new job or to get how to navigate the contract for a house, so how to find a house, so how to identify a neighborhood. So it's basically a whole project to help people to find a new home and to establish upstate New York as their new home, as well as New York for Syrian refugees. And the last part of the resources that I try to put on this was the amount of documentaries, films, and animations that would also give the people coming to the play a lot of possibilities to understand not only the Syrian migration that is the story or the backstory, the main story of the play, but also other connections of Afghani migration or Latin American migrations. So these are the resources that can be very useful for in our lobby display, as Aisha was mentioning. And also, I thought that it would be interesting for people to understand a little bit the difference between the concepts, because sometimes we tend to believe that a refugee, an asylum seeker, and a migrant, they are interconnected words, and they're not. So my decision was to start separating them using the definition that we have at UN and also the Human Rights Watch. So they have definitions in terms of what would be a refugee. So a refugee basically is a person that has to leave their home country, and because they're going through persecution, they are facing human rights violation. But in comparison to the asylum seeker, a refugee already goes to the other country with the status of a refugee. So it means that the other country supposedly expecting the other person, and the other country has the legal obligation of providing, according to the Human Rights Charter, a set of resources to the person coming from this other country. While the asylum seeker, and every single human being has the right of request asylum in another country. But the difference between the refugee and the asylum seeker is that the asylum seeker is trying to become a refugee, is applying for the status of a refugee. Which also puts the asylum seeker in a more vulnerable position, because the asylum seeker might not receive the ground as a refugee, and the asylum seeker will have to find or to try to find another country to receive asylum. And a migrant is a more broader umbrella and more also loose term, because a migrant could be a person that just decided to live in another country, or a person that also is facing human rights violation. And in this background, I try to connect also to the border migration, also for us to locate in the region, in the US as a whole, the connection with international migration, especially from Latin America. And I wanted to show to you a clip right now by Border Memorial, Dia de los Muertos. That is a short, actually it's an app created by John Craig Freeman, in which he tries to make a public art. And it's very useful for us to understand how the connection of these dead bodies or the people that disappeared trying to cross the border are inserted into the imaginary according to the new app in the public art.
Border Memorial Fronteras de los Muertos is an augmented reality public art project and memorial dedicated to the thousands of migrant workers who have died along the US-Mexico border in recent years trying to cross the desert southwest in search of work and a better life. The application uses geolocation software to superimpose individual augments at precise GPS coordinates of each recorded death, enabling the public to see the objects integrated into the physical location as if they existed in the real world. When I first started working with augmented reality, this was the first kind of project that developed in my thinking about how to create a virtual monument in this new mobile lead network space.
It's my hope that the work can act as a kind of catalyst for action within the culture. So it's simply not enough to draw attention to an issue in the world. I really want to activate people. Coming Home, it consists of virtual scenes, 8 virtual scenes distributed across the city of San Francisco, addressing homelessness and dispossession, where we asked the community to tell us their stories, and then we documented those stories in virtual reality and allowed people to experience those stories through the screens of their smartphones. People can go around the city with their cell phones looking for these virtual scenes. So it's a way of engaging the people with the space of the city itself, but then also kind of juxtaposing these experiences.
I specialize in public art and museum studies. What I think about Craig's work in particular and augmented reality, it can be democratizing. People are becoming more comfortable with this technology, using it in their own lives on a daily basis. So then Craig's work and the work of his colleagues doesn't seem so strange or distant to them. And if they can be open to the technology, if that's not a barrier, then they become open, or at least exposed to a whole kind of variety of ideas that they may not have encountered before.
Can AR drive change? I don't think that inherently AR drives the change, but I do think that art can drive change. So augmented reality art, I hope, can drive change.
Virtual and augmented reality can kind of cut through the noise of our public sphere and move people to care and to do something.
Hyundai Motor, connecting art and technology.
And excuse me, these are some of the examples of the artistic work that John Craig Freeman tries to prepare or to propose. And it's very interesting because the story of the border cannot be told without these dead bodies that we never know, that we have no accountability. So it is also an artistic movement of imagination, of trying to understand how the history, how the daily life of these migrants that simply disappeared because they were not considered or they were not protected to the level of being asylees or refugees as they try to cross the border. So what this artistic work also tries to do is to reclaim and do a work of memory, reclaiming their memory and the existence of the people that we don't know that disappeared, or the amount of or the estimated 20,000 people that have disappeared in the last 20 years crossing the border. And also it's an attempt of truth through memory, and also an attempt of constructing justice to the bodies and to the lives and to the families of these disappeared migrants. And these resources are going to be available in our lobby display, especially the resources that could be expanded and extended to the people in the community if they know people in need of these resources. And the last part of my presentation, I also wanted to show a video game that is not supposed to be fun. It's a video game that is called The Migrant Trail. Is on a series, on an artistic series called The Undocumented. So the player either have to be choosing the role of the agent patrol or the migrants trying to cross the border. And the video game shows actual footage of people trying to cross the border. And then you have to choose, for example, when someone that you know happens to get sick, for example, what do you do when you have a sick person among your group and you have to continue? Or the agent patrol that is a worker also sometimes needing to have that money to feed their family in that condition. So it is a very interesting artistic installation in the video game that is more supposed to be a social commentary of the violence that's going on at the border, that was going on in the past and still going on in the present right now. So I think this is pretty much my presentation, and I want just to emphasize that these resources are going to be available through links, especially the short movies, the animations, documentaries that are also very useful to inform this discussion in terms of world migration. And with now, I think I'll pass the word to Andy, who will be very useful to show us the routes of our play.
Thank you very much, Andre. That was wonderful. So when I first read the script of The Wetsuit Man, I was struck by the narrative and also by all of the things that I realized I didn't know, the references, the places, the geographies, the lived experiences in that story that are being, expressed beautifully through the text. And yet there are still questions that I had coming out of it. And so my primary kind of research question for one of the parts of the lobby display that I've been working on is how we can bridge the gap between theatrical representation and lived experience, right? And lived experience of different spaces specifically. And so that has led me to create this map, which was my attempt at kind of helping people who maybe have seen this show and don't have necessarily all of the references, an opportunity to go back and place different scenes and different moments of the production in context, in geographic context specifically. So without kind of giving away too much about the play, because there are certain aspects that are revealed throughout the play. We can take a quick look. I'll give you a quick kind of tour of this map and the different spaces that are portrayed or are sometimes just referenced in The Wetsuit Man. So it begins in Norway on the coast where this wetsuit has washed up. And one of the things that I wanted to do specifically with this map was to give kind of the location on a map, but then also to dive into what would this have looked like, right? We're in a theater, we're not necessarily creating in a picture perfect photorealistic way this space. So creating, for instance, Google Map, Google Street View, ways of experiencing what this space might look like, right? And this is the space where this is the town at least where in the true kind of journalistic and real life events of The Wetsuit Man, where the wetsuit was found in Lista, Norway. And this gives you a sense of what that looks like, what the climate is like, what the space looks like and feels like. Likewise, the second scene then moves down into the Netherlands, and a similar kind of strategy has been used here, being able to see what is the space like, right? And one of the things that really links a lot of these spaces is the ocean, right? These spaces of migration, of transit. Within this as well, I've tried to, I've embedded links to articles in some of these, where you can, as well as exploring the spaces, you can look at the histories of these spaces, right? And the current political situations of these spaces. And in some instances, such as at the Straits of Dover, which is one of the important locations for this story, thinking of how to think about it in human terms, right? We can sometimes think about these distances as, 21 miles across at the narrowest point on the English Channel is perhaps not that far. You can drive that in half an hour, 45 minutes. And yet, if you think about what it would take to get there without any kind of aid, it's 675 laps of an Olympic swimming pool to get from one side to the other. So once again, this attempt really with this map to try and piece together what things look like as well as what they might feel like in your body. So I think there should be a link for this map in the chat that people will be able to look at if you want to explore. And if you go see the production, which I hope people will, this looking back at this might be able to give some more of that context. And with that, I will turn it back over to Aisha to talk about the last production in the cherry season.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. That map is so interesting. And I think it's like such a cool thing to kind of like have these different ways of accessing and thinking about the world of the play in sort of broader context and just what's embodied in the experience of actually being with the actors in the space. So the last production that I want to talk about is going to be coming up in June, end of May into June, and that's a production called Pursuit, Escapement, Escape. There's not a lot I can tell you about that at the moment because it's still very much in progress. We're in the process of kind of thinking through all the pieces. It's a big and ambitious piece of our season. There is going to be, we're working with a company, a BIPOC theatre company in Toronto called B Current, who are coming down, who are bringing an adaptation of William Wells Brown's play The Escape that they have been working on. And that play really sort of traces the movement of a group of enslaved people who are trying to get from America across Niagara Falls into Canada. And so we're sort of retracing that journey, bringing this theatre company down to do a version of the play here. And then that play is going to have some responses to it. And part of the way that's going to work is graduate students are going to be working with me again. We're going to be putting together some resources and like a guide for high school students to come and see the show, because we're also in Black Lives Matter at School Year of Action at the moment. So we're hoping to bring in school groups to see this production and to have access to educational materials that help kind of frame it in the context of some of the conversations that they have been having over the course of the year. And then there will be other talkbacks and resources that we're still kind of like putting together. And then the last part of the season of this production, and the reason it's not just called Escape, is because we have these 3 other pieces that are being offered as a response to that work. So Lamar Wilson's been working on a play. He's a poet and playwright, and his new play is going to be offered as a reading. There'll be a roundtable discussion. So there'll be a public reading of the play and then a discussion of the work in progress. An alum from Cornell, Dr. Kristen Wright, is also a playwright. She's working on a piece that will be produced at the Cherry that will be picking up some of the themes from B Current's production and responding to those in another dramatic work that's sort of historically rooted. And then the last part will be a poetry installation from the wonderful poet, Professor Larry Van Cleef Stefanen, who's in the English department at Africana Studies. And she's working on a group of poems that respond to this work. And rather than just have them as printed text, they're going to be performed as sort of audio text, so people will be able to go into the Cherry space and listen to those poems. So we're really excited about that work. Part of the excitement is that we don't yet know what it's going to look like, but it's going to be terrific. And I think it'll be a really fun way to sort of to end the season with something that's so big in scope and bringing so many people from different places together. Will be kind of like a nice kind of capstone on a season that's really been a lot about the movement of people and community. So that's an overview of the season and our kind of research as practice initiative this year. So I guess we should turn it over to questions. Eleanor, if you know if there are questions for us.
Thanks so much to all of you for what you've shared today. I'm excited about the chance to, we have some time now to talk really about this kind of theater for social change, or thinking about representing social issues on stage. And what you've shared, Aisha, together with Andy and Andrea, is also the ways that you see what happens on stage in relation to all these other different kinds of work that you're doing, which I hope we have some time to reflect on together. I'll start by asking a question about, I guess, this season, although feel free to speak to it more generally. We're in a time when migration issues are, really constantly in the news. We're seeing, of course, Ukraine is on everyone's minds right now. You've brought our attention, Andre, to focus, again on the US-Mexico border and border violence more broadly. And at the same time, because of all of these expanding issues, we're also seeing in this period an expanding body of cultural work related to migration in different ways. And I wondered if you could talk about how you select the works for the stage from what I imagine is a pretty broad set of possibilities. I'm interested in whether you see the 4 works that you've talked about as sort of explicitly in conversation with each other, or if you're thinking about other issues as you decide which 3 or 4 works you might pull together for a season.
I guess I can take a stab at that one. I think, what's sort of really interesting about these 4 plays from my perspective is that they're really different. And from an Odyssey, which is initially written in like 800 BC or whatever by Homer, all the way to, plays that have not yet been written, are currently in the process of being written. That covers quite a big range, right? And so, the Wetsuit Man references a very specific moment in time in a very specific place. Homer's a different moment in time and different place. And one thing is, as from the talk back of on what happens if I don't, like that play is really kind of thinking about not locating itself in any one particular time or place. There's no sense of where that character is or when she is, or if she even is in any kind of real world. So I think for me, what's really interesting about these plays is just how different they are, that you can kind of like find a topic or a series of questions that you want to interrogate, and you can look at those through such radically different lenses. I think it's part of the appeal for me of putting together a season. These are only 4 plays, although Pursuit is technically probably 3 plays, so maybe we call it 6. But it's a small amount of work, really, when you think about it. And yet, like where I think the productive work for the audience really comes in is that you can watch any one piece and have a conversation about that piece and learn something or think about things or ask interesting questions. But if you see all of that work together, for me, part of what's really interesting is the gaps between the works, right? Is the way of, as you say, Eleanor, of thinking about them as being in conversation with each other through us, the audience, although they're not in any way in conversation with each other in terms of the writers, right? The writers have no awareness of each other even. So I think that's really interesting. I'm not sure if that totally answers your question, but.
No, I think that's helpful to think about. And I'm glad you remind us also of the move also across history in these works too, because my question focused mostly on, I guess, thinking about contemporary issues, but you're also asking us to think sort of back and forth across time in really interesting ways.
Yeah, because I mean, I think the thing particularly with an Odyssey was that, could we take a text that is written so long ago and think about the ways in which these struggles for human beings to move, redefine home, redefine themselves in terms of their identity, their access to spaces, their access to political institutions, that these are old questions being raised in new and continually problematic ways, that it's not that we have a refugee crisis now and we haven't had one before. I think the planet's had one for a very long time.
We have a question in the audience about how the arts can lead to actual change. And I'm going to build on that to try and draw out also a couple of questions that might let each of you speak specifically about the different forms that you're working with. So the question is from Anne, I would like to hear more about the role of arts to drive change. What is it about the arts? How can they move people to action beyond just broadening awareness and initiating conversations? And just building on this, I'm also thinking a lot about how, there's a lot of discussion about the role of media in shaping and reflecting migration issues and anti-immigrant sentiment, racism and xenophobia, and then also potentially sort of reshaping our ideas about otherness. So with that in mind, and acknowledging that at least the Wetsuit Man, which is the last one that you talked about, sort of in the third piece in the season, that responds also directly to news, right? It was written in response to a news story.
Yes.
So I'm thinking about the role of media here and arts as responding to media in some cases, though not all. What is it about theater that might provoke social change? So you have options here. The question from the audience about the arts more broadly, and maybe if any of you wants to speak specifically about the place of theater here. And just to get it started, I might hand it to Andy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with theater, especially, what it does so well is it puts specific moments and bodies into the conversation. Conversations that, when we think about migration, when we think about global politics, become about statistics, right? And it's very easy to distance yourself from those statistics, to fall into generalizations, to kind of forget the individuals that are in the middle of those, that are living through those moments. And so with a play like The Wetsuit Man, what it's doing so well is being able to not only humanize, because I think that, that's sort of one layer, but really forge a connection. It's not just seeing someone else as a human, it's seeing someone else as someone in the same space with you, right? And being able to live in some small way that experience, and hopefully cultivate that empathy, which, is, when we say sort of raising awareness, that it sounds kind of surface level, but at the same time, it's also building empathy, right? And being able to engage with others with very different stories, with radically different histories, in an ethical and empathic way.
Andre, did you also want to respond to this? I'm curious about how you see the place of empathy in some of the VR, the virtual reality work, for example, that you were bringing into the conversation earlier.
Thank you. I think this is great. And I just want to attribute back a little bit to what Aisha was saying before, because even though like today we are going through the global crisis of migration, which is actually so curious, or maybe I even want there to say the word hypocrite, because we became who we are as societies because of global migration. So so human societies have migrated historically. So what is it about the nation state or contemporary, or the capitalist nation state that has constructed its borders in which we no longer accept the other, we no longer accept the other bodies? And just to go to the answer in terms of how art can do something about in terms of the politics, or just to intervene, we are in a world in which conversations, like Angie was saying, are not happening because of the statistics or because of the polarization. And I feel that art has the power and the potential of dealing with the sensibilities and producing something with the sensibilities, a type of conversation that wouldn't be happening in the political discourse because of the oppositions or because of the differences. So I think the art can insert itself in this dialogue, or as Andy was saying, to propose the body again to the conversation, that we are not talking about numbers. And so I think this is what how I see art pretty much coming to the conversation, coming to the discussion as a tool for social change, because art can have social commentaries that are going to be listened and are going to be felt, and in ways that not necessarily political discourses could have been, or more direct political. And I'm talking about political in terms of Congress political, because of course art's very political, wouldn't be taking place because of this society we are located. And I feel that for our community, this play brings a lot of awareness of how should we do ourselves, because sometimes we also consider, oh, these problems are so big that I'm not implicated, that I'm not affected, it has nothing to do with me. So I think like the importance of the Cherry in Cornell bringing this play is because it brings this discomfort to us in our own communities. What should we do? What are we doing for this?
Thanks. I like your use of the word discomfort as part of where some of that transformation or at least reflection might take place. Aisha, did you want to jump in here about this? About this?
No,
question?
I mean, I think both Andy and Andre kind of cover it nicely. I think that, the takeaway for me is really that theatre is an empathy machine. That's kind of what it does. It puts you into a space breathing the same air with people who are embodying narratives, and you can see the story being told. So you're not just sort of a passive receiver. And the Cherry's work in particular is really sort of conscious of that audience-actor relationship and very conscious about making the storytelling, the telling itself, transparent in a way, I think, that kind of keeps us mindful. And then, Andre's observation too about the sort of the specificity, that I feel like there's something about theatre and stories and art that functions like a bridge between the specific and the general, right? So you take one person and one person's story and one person's emotional response to something. And then because you're looking at it and you're looking at it from a slightly different perspective, you can sort of see its aura, right? So there's this sort of general, there's access to the general outside of the specific that kind of comes from getting at things through art, because you're coming at it slant rather than in terms of information, right? Not just information.
Would it be fair, I wonder, all three of your responses to this question, and also the way that you've talked about the different kinds of materials that you're bringing and practices that you're bringing into conversation with what you are staging, make me think also of an approach of like theater as pedagogy or arts as pedagogy. I don't know if that's a fair sort of paraphrase of what you're doing.
Well, I think it's certainly fair to say that good theatre makes you both think and feel. I think theatre that's effective is doing both of those things. It's not just, entertainment. It should be entertaining insofar as it's compelling and engaging. But I think, good theatre prompts us to have reactions, both sort of cerebral reactions, but also sort of visceral or emotional reactions. And there's a part of that is absolutely, I guess, educational in some ways.
We have a question from Francesca about audience. And so I'll preface it by asking, who is your audience? Who do you see, who are you aiming for in an audience? And I know that you have a local audience and now you're also live streaming some of your performances. So who do you hope to reach? Who are you reaching? And Francesca's question is, what would you say are some of the audience reactions that stand out to you based on the work you're doing? Would love to know what stood out, surprising or notable.
I guess I can take that because I did actually talk to audience members. One of the things when we were working on And What Happens If I Don't was that the students who read the script and saw some of the rehearsals and then went and saw the production were sort of really surprised by how personal it felt, even though it's sort of this story about this one anonymous woman whose name we never learn and we don't know where she is, we don't know when. But it's so specific. It's such an interesting play that they all felt really personally connected to it, but they all picked up on different things. So one of the students was talking about her experience of reading the play and seeing the play, that it made her think a lot about institutional power and institutional racism. Another student was thinking a lot about her relationship growing up to the Catholic Church, and sort of oppression and structures and expectations for women when she was growing up. So it was sort of really interesting the way that people had really strong reactions that were completely different from seeing and reading the same play. And I think one of the other things that really struck me from seeing an Odyssey, which was staged outside, so I talked to a couple of high school students actually after the play, and asked them what they thought about it. And they were sort of surprised by how much they weren't thinking about it as an old play. They were like, when was this written, and when was this story set? And it seemed like it was sort of familiar to them because they understand myth, and they've all read Percy Jackson. But it was sort of like more the sense that they couldn't quite, they were feeling a very contemporary response to the work, which I thought was actually super interesting given how old the material actually is. That's just a couple of things.
And for Andy and Andre, what do you have in mind in terms of audience as you're thinking about some of the work that you're doing for the lobby exhibit, the online sort of additional materials?
I guess in terms of, for instance, the map, and then also work that I've done compiling articles and kind of putting it into narratives, is about what do you wish you had known, right? Sort of taking the experience of the audience as a starting point, and not assuming certain knowledge and not assuming a certain set of ideas or responses, but rather assuming or hoping at least that the play will inspire questions. Right. And the questions that individuals will have will change from person to person. And so I guess my hope and I think for all of us with curating this virtual lobby display, is to then give next lines of information, right? If someone has a question, a first question, hopefully the information can be there, and then can allow them to then find other resources and continue, like if they, questions build on questions, as we know. And so to deepen that understanding even more. And, that could be someone in middle school or high school who, doesn't know where Syria is or doesn't know where Norway is, all the way up to someone who has a much sort of greater understanding of geography and global politics, but still doesn't know the individual stories that exist therein.
Yeah, and also following that thread, I think my desire would be that my expected spectator would have questions in terms, what can I do to continue to help the community? So I watched this wonderful play. I'm affected by all of the sensibilities that it's doing. Ithaca has a wonderful community that is very related to activism. And I think my expectation would be that the people would be, okay, but I don't necessarily speak Arabic, I don't speak Spanish, or I cannot do anything. So my hopes would be, no, actually you're wrong. There are several things you can do. Those are the resources that you could direct to someone that actually need it, or also you could volunteer. So you don't know Spanish or Arabic, but you know English. And there are a lot of people wanting to learn how to speak English. So I think this is pretty much what I'd like to have, or the reflection that I'd like to have in the viewer.
Thanks. I want to get more into the plays themselves for a moment and ask about how the Cherry approaches staging what are often stories that are telling, about experiences of trauma, and what might be really difficult journeys and experiences to represent. So could you say more, Aisha, I'll start with you. Could you say more about how you think about representing different issues like this on stage?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's tricky, right? It requires a lot of care and a lot of thought to think about because theatre can be sort of shocking and moving and can catch people unawares. It's designed to evoke emotional responses. So you have to I think you have a certain responsibility to think about that stuff ahead of time. One of the things that we did that we were really fortunate to do was when we were working on the Wetsuit Man early on, Sam Bagel, the director, and I got a chance to go and have several conversations and meetings with people in Syracuse who are members of resettled Syrian populations there in Syracuse, and sort of to talk to them about, okay, so tell us things that you would want us to know that we could kind of like take with us as we think about this work. We've invited them down, they've come down, they've seen rehearsals and met the actors and had conversations. We all sort of had lunch together and sort of talked about the work. And so I think part of the approach is really to be really thoughtful about the way in which, you know, who has access to sort of what stories and how representation might work, and to always try and, you know, increase sort of the role for the underrepresented people in the process. So not just in the audience, but in the process of making the work as well. But also to remember that, you know, as actors, your job is to imagine something that is not your lived experience to some extent, right? I mean, this is kind of what actors do. They inhabit other bodies and other lives and other stories. And so there's a certain element of being willing to trust that process and be respectful of that process that's involved in putting the work together as well.
Andre and Andy, are there particular choices you've seen, you know, decisions? I'm wondering about maybe a specific example of something you've seen happen on stage that reflect some of what this process means for you. Andy, you're nodding. So
yeah, so one of the things when I was able to sit in on the rehearsals for the Wetsuit Man that I think really showed that to me was the way that actors would inhabit characters without any pretense of actually being these characters, right? There's a certain distance that is presented when a character says, okay, I'm going to play this part now, right? And we know that this person is not this person, that there is distance between them. And yet we see this kind of alchemical process of becoming that person, of being able to, even though they're not the same person, and in a way they're incommensurable, we are able to still feel something through the actor, right? And the actor is kind of this strange medium between these different stories that help you feel it without confusing reality with the story that is behind it.
You put that really well, and it strikes me as returning us to an earlier question about what's the role of theater specifically. And it's interesting to me what you say about being able to, as an audience member, let yourself be immersed in an experience, but also simultaneously you're aware the whole time that it's a performance. And that seems really crucial to what you're saying the effect might be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, really crucial. And one of the ways it differs from film, for example, right, where the rules about suspension of disbelief are quite different. So it's one of the ways I think that theatre really specifically functions to tell these stories, is that you're both in the community of the storytelling by being in the space with the actors, and also aware that you're in that community and that it is storytelling and that these people are actors. So it's sort of double kind of like sensibility.
I think also in terms of the staging, it's to be praised that the Cherry is very brave, you know, of staging this display, staging the Wetsuit Man, especially because it would be very easy to, you know, not having this commitment, but at the same time, the Cherry has the decision of establishing a conversation that a lot of times is just postponed because, you know, as Angie was saying, the actors could potentially say, I'm not that person. I'm not representing myself. And I feel it has a lot of bravery of, like, you know, of deciding actually to engage with the pain, and in this whole global conversation, bringing the global to the local.
I'm going to have to wrap up as we come to a close. I know that our eCornell colleagues have been putting a few links in the chat. To wrap up the conversation, I'll just offer each of you a moment to share maybe either how people can check out the work that you've been talking about, so a way to access it, whether they're here in Ithaca, or I know we have people joining from all over. And if there are other resources that you wanted to name, or perhaps other works that are on your mind beyond what we've talked about in this season, I'd love to hear some of those examples. And I'll pass it to Andy first.
Yeah, thank you. So one play that came out in the past few years that also does this work really beautifully, thinking about how stories change over time and how they change over geographic space, is Indecent by Paula Vogel, which takes, it's a very different discussion. It's a very different history, and yet has this ability of kind of transcending time and space. So I would highly recommend that for anyone. There, you can stream it online. There are places to do that. I believe on Broadway HD, or even just reading the script, which is published, is a great one. And then another thing that might be timely is a show that will be coming through Ithaca also this week on Thursday by the Bread and Puppet Theater, called Finished Waiting, which is stitching together questions of waiting and, waiting during a pandemic, waiting in the political process, and equally waiting in migration situations, and how those different forms of waiting are all tied together.
Thanks. Andre?
I think one of the works that I had on the back of my mind when I was trying to collect resources is Sleep Dealer by Alex Rivera. It's a fantastic movie. I think it's actually even available on YouTube. It might be, I'm not sure. To like free access, open access by the director, I think. And the reason why I'm saying about this movie is because this movie shows a lot of like the desire of having the migrant. At the same time, I desire the work, but I don't desire the body. So, I want you to be working here, but I don't want you here. And this is what really made me think about when I was trying to collect these resources. And yeah, I think that's it. And I I'm very appreciative of this opportunity of being here and talking to you all.
Thanks. Isha, where can people find more information about the Wetsuit Man and the website that will be, I think, more openly available?
Yeah, so it's all going to be on the website, the website for the Cherry. So that's thecherry.org. That's our website. You can find tickets there. You can get access to the virtual lobby display there, and also find out more about the other work that's going to be happening a little later in the semester as we bring Pursuit, we bring in Escape from Be Current when they come down from Toronto, or talkbacks. All of that information will be documented and easily accessible from the website.
Wonderful. Thanks so much again for sharing your work with us today, and thanks to the audience for being here with us.
Thanks for having us. I really appreciate it.